Atheist Church. Atheists, agnostics, secular humanists, whatever you like to call yourself, you are welcome here. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural promoted from the podium. I'm going to start off by sharing with you our creed. Seattle Atheist Church was founded on the principles of scientific naturalism and secular ethics. Truth claims are attempted here, and we stand ready to revise our thinking in light of new information. We attempt to be excellent to all conscious beings, and we believe in good, because good works in non-mysterious ways. If that sounds about right to you, then you're probably in the right place, and so welcome. I don't have anything to announce today, but last week was... Oh, there's a bike ride after church, but so if you have your bike, then, and there's going to be a bike ride next week after church. No, the actual bike ride. Okay, so the actual bike ride is the Emerald City ride, and it's a Cascadian bicycle club. I don't know if there's still space in the ride. You can sign up and ride with us. I guess I'll put out some contact information if you're going to ride in the ride and you want to ride with us, for you to be able to find us on the day. All right, without further ado, welcome up Troy. Looking forward to it.
Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about gentrification. I'll kind of go through explanation of what it is, kind of some myths about gentrification, and then I'll talk about a specific local Seattle example. So my first one is I'm going to read a PBS article by Benjamin Grant, who's an urban designer and city planner and a writer from the San Francisco Bay Area. And it is titled, What is Gentrification? What is gentrification? Gentrification is, in general term, for the arrival of wealthier people in an existing urban district, a related increase in rent and property values, and changes in the district's character and culture. The term is often used negatively, suggesting the displacement of poor communities by rich outsiders. But the effects of gentrification are complex, contradictory, and its real impact varies. Many aspects of gentrification process are desirable. Who wouldn't want to see reduced crime, new investments in buildings and infrastructure, and increased economic activity in their neighborhoods? Unfortunately, the benefits of these changes are often enjoyed disproportionately by the new arrivals, while the established residents find themselves economically and socially marginalized. Gentrification has been the cause of painful conflict in many American cities, often along radical racial and economic fault lines. Neighborhood change is often viewed as a miscarriage of social justice, in which wealthy, usually white, newcomers are congratulated for their improving a neighborhood whose poor minority residents are displaced by skyrocketing rents and economic change. Although there is not a clear-cut technical definition of gentrification, it is characterized by several changes. Demographics. An increase in median income, a decline in the proportion of racial minorities, and a reduction in household size, as low-income families are replaced by young singles and couples. Real estate markets. Large increases in rent and home prices, increases in the number of evictions, conversion of rental units to ownership, condos, and new development of luxury housing. Land use. A decline in industrial uses, an increase in office or multimedia uses, the development of live work lofts, and high-end housing, retail, and restaurants. And lastly, cultural and character. New ideas about what is described and attractive, including standards, either informal or legal, for architecture, landscaping, public behavior, noise, and nuance. How does it happen? America's renewed interest in city life has put a premium on urban neighborhoods, few of which have been built since World War II. People are flocking to new jobs in new regions where housing is scarce. Pressure builds on areas once considered undesirable. Gentrification tends to occur in districts with particular qualities that make them desirable and ripe for change. The convenience, diversity, and vitality of urban neighborhoods are major draws. as in the availability of cheap housing, especially if the buildings are distinctive and appealing. Old houses or industrial buildings often attract people looking for fixer-uppers and investment opportunities. Gentrification works by accretion, gathering momentum like a snowball. Few people are willing to move into an unfamiliar neighborhood across class and racial lines. Once a new familiar faces are present, more people are willing to make the move. Word travels that the attractive neighborhood has been divorced and the pace of change, accelerates rapidly. Consequences of gentrification. In certain respects, a neighborhood that is gentrified can become a victim of its own success. The unwrapped spiral of desirability and increasing rents and property values often erodes the very qualities that began attracting new people in the first place. When success comes to neighborhoods, it does not always come to its established residents, and the displacement of the community and gentrification's most troubling effect. No one is more vulnerable to the effects of gentrification than renters. When prices go up, tenants are pushed out, whether through natural turnover or rent hikes or evictions. When buildings are sold, buyers are often evict the existing tenants to move in themselves. Combine several units or bring in new tenants and higher rate. When residents own their own homes, they are less vulnerable and may not opt to cash them in and move elsewhere. Their options may be limited if there is a regional housing shortage. However, cash does not always compensate for less tangible losses. The economic effect of gentrification vary widely, but the arrival of new investment, new spending power, and a new tax base usually results in significant increased economic activity. Rehabilitation, housing development, new shops and restaurants, and new higher wage jobs are often part of the picture. Precious residents may benefit from some of this development, particularly in the form of service sector and construction jobs. But much of it may be out of reach to all the well-educated newcomers. Some local economic activity may also be forced out, either by rising rents or shifting sensibilities. Industrial activities that employ local workers may be viewed as a nuisance or environmental hazard by the new arrivals. Local shops may lose their leases under pressure from posh boutiques and restaurants. Physical changes also accompany gentrification. Older buildings are rehabilitated and new construction occurs. Public improvements to streets, parks, and infrastructures may accompany government revitalization efforts or occur as new residents organize to demand public services. New arrivals often push hard to improve district aesthetically and may codify new standards through design guidelines, historic preservation legislation, and the use of blight and nuance laws. The social, economic, and physical impact of gentrification often results in serious political conflict, exaggerated by differences in race, class, and culture. Earlier residents may feel embattled, ignored, and excluded from their own communities. New arrivals are often misclassified by assumptions that their efforts to improve local conditions are perceived as hostile or even racist. Change in fortunes in populations in the physical fabric of communities is an abiding feature of urban life, but change nearly always involves winners and losers, and low-income people are rarely the winners. The effect of gentrification vary widely with particular local circumstances. Residents, community development, corporations, and city governments across the country are struggling to manage these inevitable changes to create a win-win situation for everyone involved. So that's kind of what gentrification is and how it grows and develops. Now here's another article called The 5 Myths About Gentrification. And this is from the Washington Post on June 3rd of last year by Lance Freeman. Everything about gentrification is controversial, even its definition. One recent study by sociologist Michael Barton compared how the New York Times and researchers used the term to talk about city neighborhoods. He found very little agreement about where change was happening. That's not the only thing we can't agree on. Gentrification is painted alternately as a destroyer of neighborhoods or a savior of cities. These competing views are driven in part by misconceptions about what the word means and what it entails. There are some of the most common myths. Number 1, gentrification leads to lower crime. Over the past decade, urban crime rates have dropped precipitously. City watchers often point to gentrification. A letter to the editor in the New Orleans Times, "A city getting safer, one of the chief byproducts of gentrification." A Mick article attributed a 30% crime drop in one Brooklyn neighborhood to the phenomenon. The logic is simple. Poor neighborhoods tend to have more crime. Gentrification, which brings in an influx of wealthier residents, should lower the crime rate. In fact, studies of the relationship between crime and gentrification have found the opposite. Gentrification often leads to increase in crime. One study found that larceny and robbery went up in gentrified neighborhoods across the country. There are at least 2 explanations for this pattern. The new, wealthier residents might be more lucrative targets for would-be burglars and robbers, perhaps enticing them to engage in more illegal acts. And crime thrives on instability. Anonymity and weak social ties, all which make it easier for criminals to blend in and less likely for neighborhoods to look out for one another. Gentrification, by definition, destabilizes the neighborhood. Number 2, gentrification causes widespread displacement. For many, gentrification is synonymous with the expulsion of low-crime residents. As urbanist Richard Florida wrote in City Lab, displacement can be a big issue in places where gentrification is occurring at a feverish pace. The Charlotte Observer warned that gentrification may be complicated, but it is not a myth and neither is displacement. Of course, with neighborhoods change, some families do get pushed out, but my research shows that longtime residents aren't more likely to move when their neighborhood gentrifies. Sometimes they're actually less likely to, in part because of the improvement gentrification can bring. In one study, I found that the probability that a household would be displaced in a gentrified neighborhood in New York was 1.3%. A 2015 study in Philadelphia found similar. That neighborhood income gains did not significantly predict household exit rates. What distinguishes gentrification is not who moves out, it's who moves in. In a gentrified neighborhood, new residents are more likely to be well off. As a result, the neighborhood's property makeup can shift. Even if no one leaves, in 2004, I found that a neighborhood's poverty rate could drop from 30% to 12% in a decade with minimal displacement. That's because gentrification often leads to new construction or to investment in once vacant properties. It is also worth noting that the vast majority of poor neighborhoods across the country aren't gentrifying. Outside of hot metro areas such as New York, Washington, and San Francisco, and of course here in Seattle, most poor places stay poor. Longtime residents hate gentrification. It's number 3. Gentrification has a decidedly negative connotation, often painted as a loss for a neighborhood's old-timers. But this idea is amplified by the press, as in these Time magazine article about gentrification in the Big Easy claimed that when native New Orleans talk, the topic inevitably turns to conflict with the new migrants. In a story about a proposed apartment building in Washington, Bloomberg View's columnist Megan McArdle wrote that longtime residents were vehemently opposed on the grounds that this would cause gentrification. New York Daily News columnist Josh Green described this as a "we were here first" attitude. Of course, some people don't want to see their neighborhoods change, but often residents appreciate certain aspects of gentrification. Homeowners stand to gain a windfall as the value of their property appreciates, increased rent, retail activity brings more goods and services to the one-floor areas. With gentrification, residents may no longer find it necessary to travel outside their neighborhood to have a sit-down meal and arrive themselves or fresh produce. Whether residents appreciate the change comes down to 2 things: the amenities in their neighborhood prior to gentrification, and whether the new services benefit the people who live there. In neighborhoods with severe disinvestment lacking many retail services that most people take for granted, one may find long-term residents who appreciate gentrification. As the Washington City paper wrote about the district, most longtime residents of low-income neighborhoods don't clamor for gentrification. Exactly, but they do want the things that it brings. Grocery stores and other retail within walking distance, better transit connections, reduced crime, and attention from the city government. Number 4, gentrifiers are white. The stereotypical image of gentrifiers is bearded white guy on a fixie or a young white professional who treats her dog like a spoiled child. One DC resident protested white gentrifiers in his neighborhood with lawn signs. Spike Lee has also talked about the phenomenon in explicitly racial tones, asking, why does it take an influx of white New Yorkers in the South Bronx, in Harlem, in Bed-Stuy, in Crown Heights for the facilities to get better? As the website Gizmodo put in, across the United States, white infill is associated with gentrification. But gentrification is hardly a white thing. In many neighborhoods, middle-class Asians, blacks, and Latinos are part and partial of the process. Millennials and young professionals of all races appreciate the attractions and conveniences of city living. In a 2009 study, I found that gentrifying neighborhoods are more racially diverse than non-gentrifying ones. There's another reason for this too. Kesha Moore of Drew University has shown that professionals are drawn to some low-income minority neighborhoods because of desire to give back to the community where they or their parents grew up. In minority neighborhoods that are gentrifying, non-white gentrifiers aren't as noticeable as white ones. And even when we do notice them, we don't call them gentrifiers. And lastly, number 5, gentrification happens naturally. When we talk about a gentrified neighborhood, we may imagine something specific. A bustling street with new coffee shops, boutique clothing stores, and artisanal breweries. Gentrification probably does not mean getting a Starbucks or another upscale cafe, Gizmodo wrote. In fact, the coffee chain is so synonymous with the phenomenon that The Guardian asked, in gentrified cities, which came first, Starbucks or higher real estate prices? Is it true that a lot of gentrifying neighborhoods get the same amenities? But it's not inevitable. As sociologist Sylvie Tizot has shown, gentrifiers don't really rely on market forces alone to bring the types of restaurants and shops capable with a neighborhood's new image. The same gentrifiers who are drawn to a low-income neighborhood for cheaper housing might also work to change the area more to their liking. This might mean leaning on police and code enforcers to drive out seedy bars, or pushing policymakers to provide subsidies to businesses that fit in. To be sure, market forces help change commerce in gentrifying neighborhoods. But often lurking behind the invisible hand are activists and policymakers who wish to nudge the market to produce certain outcomes. Sometimes the poor try to use these same levers to change their neighborhoods. Consider Harlem, where residents in the 1970s sought to stabilize their community by luring middle-class homeowners in retail. Their success may have paved the way for outsiders to invest more in and spur gentrification, but change began long before the demographic shift. So those are a few misconceptions about gentrification. Now I want to talk about our own gentrification here in Seattle, specifically Capitol Hill. I found an article in the Seattle Times called Culture Class as Gentrification Engulfs Capitol Hill, and I've taken a few excerpts out of that. And this is by Tricia Romano. So Capitol Hill is a formerly blue-collar neighborhood that became a home for artists and the gay community decades ago and is now in the throes of yet another transformation. Gleaming new apartment buildings and posh eateries, big dance clubs and craft cocktails lounges that have replaced quaint auto row buildings and inexpensive restaurants. Weekend nights on Pike and Pine, now the epicenter of Seattle's nightlife, have become a source of tension for longtime residents. Throngs of young, preppy partiers descend on the clubs, overtaking the drag queens and tattooed rockers. In Capitol Hill, if Capitol Hill were a high school, it'd be a classic showdown of jocks and prom queens versus freaks and geeks. Not everyone would call it progress. Luxury apartment buildings such as the Sunset Electric on the 11th and Pine, with one bedrooms that rent for more than $4,500, seem to open weekly, filling up with more affluent residents, many of them tech workers. Once the province of the starving artists, a fifth of the neighborhood's households now make more than $100,000 a year. In 2000, only 1 in 17 crossed that six-figure threshold, according to research firm Experian. The evolution is more apparent on weekend nights in the Pike Pine corridor. Gay bars are no longer the predominant bars in that neighborhood, said Mayor Ed Murray. If you are out there on Saturday night, it's lots of young straight people lined up outside clubs and bars and restaurants. There are more than 200 restaurants and bars on the hill below 15th Avenue, with many of the large new spots like Q and Ryan House opening within a few blocks of each other. Together, Capitol Hill's bars and restaurants can hold more than 19,000 people, as many as Key Arena during a concert. Most of that concentrated around Pike and Pine. With the influx of hard partying crowds, crime spiked, particularly during the summer when muggings at knife point and a few gunpoint happened around Callister Park. In 2004, there were 35 reported bias incidents in the police precinct covering Capitol Hill, 11 more than the year before. And just after midnight on New Year's Day 2014, an arsonist set fire to the gay nightclub neighbors. Sale Police Chief Catherine O'Toole said that although the uptick is relatively small, sometimes perception of crime is damaging as crime itself. Fear of crime can really undermine a community. Tensions peaked last September when police held a public meeting and promised to increase foot patrols. I don't think we've adjusted to how we police a dense, active nightlife neighborhood that we've never had before, Murray said. I don't believe that we've asked enough questions around the number of liquor licenses being issued in a concentrated area. Shelley Brothers, one of the owners of the Wild Rose, the city's sole lesbian bar, has watched the change over 15 years. The thing that took us all by surprise was the degree of homophobia and misogyny that started all of a sudden with this influx of crowds. I got used to not being called a dyke or a bitch or names at night, she said. Now it seems we're back to that. So that's a little bit of our history of our own gentrification here. I think we should get together and talk about gentrification and what it means and what we can do. Thank you.